Okay, class. On our syllabus, we have moved up to the Arab Spring this week and the Arab Winter. Next week, we'll handle immigration policy. If semester C was still sailing and things were normal, they'd be in Morocco right now, which is why we're going to cover some of the biggest events in the last decade in that region. And I just want to say it's interesting to note when we get to the Arab Spring and to the political governance of North Africa and the Middle East. The book that, if you did a graduate version of this class, the book that you'd be reading would be the one that we've been taking selections from over the course of this semester from Francis Fukuyama, who happens to be, I think if you had to pigeonhole him or categorize him as more of a traditionalist political philosopher, if you had to force it to be more on the conservative side. And so it was interesting when he came out in 2008 and not only said he was going to vote for Barack Obama, but that he was openly endorsing Barack Obama. And he stated in 2008, "I'm voting for Barack Obama for a very simple reason. It is hard to imagine a more disastrous presidency than that of George W. Bush. It was bad enough that he launched an unnecessary war and undermined the standing of the United States throughout the world in his first term. But in the waning days of his administration, he presided over a collapse of the American financial system and broader economy that will have consequences for years to come. As a general rule, democracies don't work well if voters do not hold political parties accountable for failure." I think it would have been a travesty to reward Republicans for failure on such a grand scale. Now, I know many of my FYS students out there listening to this, you were born right around 9/11. It's so fascinating to see that you guys are the generation of 9/11 to this pandemic. And so I don't assume you have many memories at all of George W. Bush. But this is one of the iconic photos that came to symbolize just how disconnected from reality and how obtuse about how things were when he had this victory celebration on an aircraft carrier late in the spring of 2003 when our troops had made it to Baghdad. And we assumed that because they had made it to Baghdad, we had won. Mission accomplished. We were going to pack up, hand Iraq over to some provisional authority and allow democracy to flourish. We will have gotten our revenge for the terrorist incident of 9/11. We would have cleaned up a region that we thought was full of terrorists and conspiring against us, and we had beaten them on the field of battle. And go America, and go George W. Bush. Because even as this photo is being taken, the country is unraveling, and then the speed of it would pick up over the years after 2003. Because similar to the Powell Doctrine outlined after Vietnam, we hadn't done any of the things that the Powell Doctrine require that you do to invade Iraq, and we had no idea of the chaos that we would be having to manage and navigate in a part of the world we had very little working knowledge of. And we didn't even realize the extent to which the chaos that was engulfing Iraq was caused directly and indirectly by the behavior of soldiers and our foreign policy in this region. And you can't understand the Arab Spring or the Arab Winter or the situation in that region without understanding the calamitous impact of this invasion of Iraq and how it destabilized a region that admittedly had a lot of sclerosis, a lot of corruption, a lot of frustrated young people in that region, and that even part of the dynamics of propped up corrupt monarchies and rulers were in part because of our foreign policy during the Cold War. And the whole region itself doesn't really make a lot of sense in terms of the lines of countries because they were drawn by European powers, primarily England and France, shortly after they'd won World War I and carved up this region as they had carved up sub-Saharan Africa in 1913 in Berlin. And the whole region, therefore, it was fragile. And because that fragility ran head-on into this calamitous invasion and then much more calamitous occupation, the region has been in turmoil since then with refugee crises and ongoing civil wars and humanitarian crises. So after that photo's taken, this becomes the reality on the ground. And the failure of the Bush administration also led to the very unpopular regime or the prime ministership of Tony Blair because he had supported Bush. And the incredible failure of the Bush presidency in terms of foreign policy and military policy after 9/11, the failure of 9/11 itself, the lack of due diligence in keeping the borders safe, the failure of the response to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and then at the end of his presidency, the ultimate and complete meltdown of the economy meant that not only was his administration a failure, but his administration was such a failure that it essentially rotted the Republican brand. The Republican Party never fully recovered, such that 8 years later, someone as disruptive, provocative, not serious, and yet totally serious Donald Trump could come in and take over the primary process and take over the Republican Party. You can't understand the ability or the reality of President Trump, Republican President Trump, without realizing that his ascent was made possible because of the degradation and destruction of the traditional Republican Party as a brand at the end of the Bush presidency. No way Trump gets through the primaries and beats others long-standing, respectable Republicans unless long-standing, respectable Republicans are not desired and detested and rejected by the voters, which is what happened. And that's what Trump was able to capitalize on in 2015 and 16, was a Republican Party that didn't even control its own primaries. It didn't control its own selection and nomination process. He hijacked it. He took it over. And to this day now, there really is no authentic independent Republican Party. There's the party of Trump. And then much of that blame goes towards the destruction wrought by the Bush administration. Fukuyama argues that the U.S. and President Bush and his administration made three major mistakes. Number one, overstating the threat of radical Islam to the U.S. to justify this terrible invasion of Iraq and terrible occupation. Number two, failing to foresee the fierce negative reaction to its benevolent hegemony. The United States thought because we were well-intentioned, we had good intentions, that people would respect that, honor that, give us the benefit of the doubt. They didn't. They didn't support our invasion. They didn't support the occupation. And when things turned south, they didn't come in to help us. From the very beginning, showing a negative attitude toward the UN, which we did, and other intergovernmental organizations like like NATO and our allies, like France and Germany, and not seeing that it would increase anti-Americanism in other countries, which the Bush administration engendered enormous amounts of backlash against Americans. And then the third mistake was misjudging what was needed to bring peace to Iraq and being overly optimistic about the success with which social engineering of Western values could be applied to Iraq and the Middle East in general. If there's one of the many themes of this FYS is to beware of hubris and arrogance, that our Western model is one that can be exported everywhere easily and that it'll be embraced and be successful elsewhere as it has been in the United States. And that's something that we have learned in this class, is to be wary of that, to see the shortcomings and unintended consequences of that arrogance. And here's where the Arab Spring started. And it's such a fascinating little story here in Tunisia, and it spreads to Egypt, and then over to Libya, and then over to Iraq. Saudi Arabia is pushing back against it to make sure it doesn't happen there. And then, of course, eventually the dissolution and power vacuum that we trigger in Iraq spills over into Syria and into a migration and refugee crisis. You can see it's just of course, it's all much easier to see in retrospect. At the time, we were just trying to figure things out. But by not doing our homework and not being humble and not listening, when we invaded Iraq in 2003 and then poorly occupied it, we had no idea that not only would this be a disaster, but it would lead to other crises in the region. So the Arab Spring starts in late 2010 and peters out in about 2013, giving way to the Arab Winter, which we'll discuss and talk more about on Thursday. And for class, you all read this, essentially a book, The Fractured Lands, How the Arab World Came Apart. I know it was massive, and it probably took you all weekend to read it. But I think it's one of the best assignments I could have given you to do two things: to give you the background history of the region, its colonial origins with Europe, Its metamorphosis somewhat during the Cold War. And so it gives you the macro level view of the big actors and the big history. And then the bulk of the article comes down to 6 ordinary individuals in the Arab lands. It allows you to see it from the micro level and to see how these themes and trends and issues are impacting individuals, because in the aggregate, that's the experience of these regions. And this whole saga ties back and connects to two of the fundamental ideas of Freakonomics. First one, incentives are the cornerstone of life. We've covered that many times. But 2 that we haven't revisited in a while. Number 2, conventional wisdom is often wrong. Conventional wisdom is often wrong. There was so much conventional wisdom, a lot of it espoused by the Bush administration, about how this Iraq invasion was going to play out and how the occupation would play out. And there was just reams of expert advice and opinion, and none of it played out. There was expert conventional wisdom about weapons of mass destruction that were never there, that justified the invasion. There was expert advice and conventional wisdom about how we would be embraced as liberators. Not true. There was expert advice and conventional wisdom of how this would lead to a draining of the swamp in other countries. Iraq would be first, and then there would be Libya and Egypt and Syria, and it would just be a blossoming of American-style Western democracy, and none of that played out, just the opposite. Point number 3, or fundamental idea number 3, dramatic effects. Tipping points often have distant, tiny, subtle causes. Exhibit A for this last point is this obscure, ordinary mid-20s fruit and vegetable vendor in Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi, who reaches literally the end of his rope after all the petty bullying he experiences in Tunisia, just trying to eke out a living. But he's getting all this harassment by corrupt police officers and low-level government officials about the permits he needed and the permissions he had to get, and all this corruption to try to eke out his living. And then he literally just had a moment where mixture of anger and rage and despair and probably some sort of depression, who knows, just in a fit of rage and despair, he sets himself on fire, commits suicide. And in so many times in life, that would have been, you would never even have heard of it. It would have been an incident that was never even known outside his own neighborhood. Yet in this instance, it just happened to be the spark, the catalyst. At this moment in time, with all this built-up frustration and anger by a large proportion of the youth, the 20% of the population in the Arab world that's young and frustrated and doesn't see a future, that combining with the fragility and chaos engendered by our failed occupation of Iraq and the destabilization of the region, all that coalesces into the beginning of protests that grow and grow and grow in Tunisia. You can see all these young people. This fruit and vegetable vendor becomes for them sort of a symbol or a martyr for all of their pent-up rage and anger, and it just allows it to be unleashed and destabilizes the political order in Tunisia. And you can see in this graph, this is one of the most important graphs, to understand that pent-up, long-running rage and frustration and anger is a big function of the fact that in the Arab world, the youth population is large, makes up a large proportion of the entire population, upwards of 17, 18, 19, even more than 20% of the population are young people ages 15 to 24. And a lot of them are unemployed with no hope for the future, in part because these economies are so stagnant. They are run by dictators and authoritarian rulers who are full of corruption and are deathly afraid of ever being turned out of office for being held responsible or being victims of revenge. And so they continue their sclerotic rule, but they have more and more young people who are absolutely at the point at which they are not willing to play by the rules and keep the peace anymore. And a kingdom for a house, what drives such people to extremes is not simply the difficulty of scraping a living and being harassed by the law, but the seemingly inescapable bind that they find themselves in. Arab social conventions remain rigid. Marriage is a prerequisite for sex, and having a house or an apartment, a flat, is a prerequisite for marriage. So one thing you have to get the next thing. To be unable to afford a house or an apartment or a flat is to remain in a state of dependency. You're living with your parents in your basement, like the one I'm in right now, with no hope for having your own independence in the future. Bad state planning, poor access to finance, tangled property laws, and rapid population growth all ensure that in most Arab countries, demand for affordable housing far outstrips supply. This, as you've seen so many times in this class, that large 20% of the population in the Arab world can, for the most part, maintain these bottom two rungs of Maslow's hierarchy, but they can't get apartments, they can't get married, can't have sex, can't have a family, can't have a career, can't establish these other upper regions of Maslow's hierarchy that all human beings universally and for all of time have always wanted to get up to. So Tunisia, the revolts then, like a virus, spread to Egypt. And Egypt is a perfect place for those forces to also spark, because you have a strongman rule by using terrorist models of prisons and torture of people who are not compliant. He's been there forever. There's whole generations of people and young people in the Arab world who've only ever known one ruler of their country. And Mubarak in Egypt was there for 30 years and would have continued and would have handed it on to his children, nepotism-wise, except that these revolts turned out in Tahrir Square and forced Egypt and forced him to step down. Now, I would love to say, and then it led to all these wonderful reforms and a blossoming of the middle class and, a reformation, but not so.
They called it a sea of people as millions of Egyptians ended a 30-year-old rule with peaceful protests. But not much has changed since the fall of Hosni Mubarak. 6 years on, human rights organizations argue Egyptians have lost basic liberties.
Unhappy with the brief rule of the Muslim Brotherhood under President Morsi, many Egyptians welcomed President Sisi's military coup in 2013, but he has produced a rule that is far more repressive than anything that happened even under President Mubarak, who was overthrown in the brief Arab Spring.
President Sisi came to power promising security and prosperity, but since the Morsi government was removed in a military coup, the number of attacks on Egyptian security forces have spiked in the Sinai Peninsula and elsewhere. Critics say that in the garb of an anti-terror clampdown, political opponents have also been rounded up. In the years after the revolution, more than 41,000 people have been jailed by Egypt's security forces. Just in December, activists say there were 154 cases of enforced disappearances. There's a rising number of people who are being put on Egypt's expanding terror list.
Similar to South Africa, when you have an authoritarian terrorist rule, people who disagree with the ruling powers aren't just dissidents or people who are allowed to have a different opinion. They get labeled as terrorists, which strips them of all human rights and protections and allows the governments, like they did in South Africa under apartheid and here, to single out those people, call them terrorists, and then take very extreme measures against them.
About 1,500 or more than 1,500 people. Many of them are well-known businessmen, some of them media persons. I think the crackdown will get wider, and I think what the regime is trying to do is more or less to terrorize any potential opposition that stands against it, especially among the elite, especially among famous individuals, popular individuals.
The economy too isn't doing very well. There is a shortage of foreign currency reserves and liquidity. The Egyptian currency is valued at 18 pounds against the dollar. It used to be 6 pounds in 2012. And petroleum products such as fuel and gas have gone up by up to 40%. Saudi Arabia over the transfer of two islands has been the latest incident in sharply declining ties among the two countries. Former diplomats say the warming of ties between Russia over Syria and Libya are a risky foreign policy shift. A lot has changed since the first chance at Tahrir Square, but many aspirations of the protesters remain unfulfilled. Osama bin Javed, Al Jazeera.
You can already see the signs of the Arab winter. Excuse me, I'm sorry for the cough. So, just all this pent up rage and anger and despair spills out in the Arab Spring, demanding reforms and change and an opportunity, especially for younger people, to write their own futures. It's ironic. So Mubarak, who's a cruel dictator, gets pushed out. Morsi comes in with the Muslim Brotherhood for a few years. and struggles to run the country because, like so many of the sub-Saharan African countries, when the ruling powers left, they didn't leave a strong, functioning state that could order schools and food and transportation and affordable living. Morsi comes in and it doesn't work. The only thing that works is running a very intimidating police state. And so he's then tossed out by the military, so typical of places where things don't work. The military steps into the power vacuum. They put one of their own in. Sisi comes in, and he runs an even more oppressive regime than Mubarak did. And irony of ironies, he's a big fan of President Trump, and Trump's a big fan of his, and he's visited the White House on multiple occasions. At the same time that the Arab Spring is taking root and blossoming in Egypt, there's just like a symbolic end to how this whole thing began back in 9/11 of 2001. In this iconic photo during the Obama administration, this is on May 1st, the killing of Osama bin Laden being filmed in the Situation Room in the White House by live camera feeds from Navy SEALs in Pakistan who are storming the compound where he's in. And it's just interesting because it took 10 years for this to happen, to find the person who sort of is the spark of all of this engagement and much of it failure by the United States because of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And they end up killing him, but to what effect? What's accomplished besides some sense of revenge? But it's at this point, even Osama bin Laden is sidelined as a non-serious participant in this whole thing that has spiraled out of control in the Middle East. So you kill him, you announce it, but it's like nothing. It's not like his death brings anything substantial in terms of improvement of the situation. Okay, now this Arab Spring continues to migrate like a virus, move around, and then it moves to another country with a similar long-running, oppressive, authoritarian ruler in Libya. That's Muammar Gaddafi, who'd been there even longer than Mubarak and had used even more oppressive means of holding back any dissent, any disagreement. And Gaddafi had even been involved in some global terrorist campaigns. And so the United States was faced with a situation in Libya. They by no means was the Obama administration willing to go in with troops to influence this uprising like they had in Iraq. They had learned their lesson, but it's not taking the same path in Egypt where Mubarak voluntarily stepped down. Gaddafi wasn't stepping down in Libya, and so the U.S. felt like the leaders felt like they were forced with the situation of what, if any, involvement do they have in this situation? I mean, what is the plan? There has to be, the thinking is if they don't do something, it just continues to get more and more chaotic, and Libya just spirals out of control. So interestingly, what the U.S. ends up doing is arming the rebels. They don't go in militarily. They don't become directly involved, but they arm some of the groups that are rising up against Gaddafi's government. And in this famous photo, the armed rebels find Gaddafi, who had been hiding, and they torture him. Clearly, he's abused here. He's all bloodied. And then very soon after this still photograph comes from a video footage. He's executed by his own golden gun with the members of this militia. And so thinking is, well, is this a success? I mean, it's not a peaceful stepping down like Mubarak, but this horrible authoritarian semi-terrorist leader is down, he's gone. So is this an example of success? We learn very soon after that happens that Libya descends into greater and greater chaos. And a situation that we thought probably couldn't get much worse did become worse, because as bad as Gaddafi was, he at least ruled Libya as rough and as dictatorially as he did. It was not chaotic. It was just oppressive. And the chaos then spilled over into our embassy, and our ambassador was killed along with some staff members. And that led to this famous photo of the Benghazi embassy debacle that was blamed on Hillary Clinton. And then, of course, by extension, it became a point of criticism of the Obama and the entire administration, and particularly the Obama administration's foreign policy in the Middle East. And I'm just projecting by looking in their faces. There's just all kinds of thoughts probably going through their head of, this is a quagmire they inherited from the previous administration. They can't get out of it. They can't win it. They definitely don't want to get deeper into it, but they can't seem to extricate themselves. And they're muddling through tragedies and messes like this that they are not in control of. And it's ironic, Hillary's takeaway message from Libya was the failure stemmed from not having enough American involvement, and the US wasn't sufficiently involved in there, and that's why this power vacuum developed, and the chaos and the embassy debacle is all an extension of a lack of US involvement in Libya, and a lack of US presence in Libya. And President Obama drew a somewhat different conclusion, which is, nothing probably. His takeaway was the only way it might work is if you're willing to commit massive troops to run the country. The big lesson of Iraq and Libya is the only way it might ever work is if you have so many troops in that country, you are essentially running it as an extension of a mini state of the United States. And so his lesson was more, we're not going to do that, and so we need to completely withdraw from this region. Why? Because maybe nothing works. A cynical line would begin to circulate in Washington. In Iraq, the United States had intervened and occupied, and things had gone to hell. In Libya, the United States had intervened but not occupied, and things had still gone to hell. And in Syria, as we'll cover on Thursday, the United States had neither intervened nor had it occupied, and things had still gone to hell. Takeaway message, maybe nothing works in the Middle East in terms of U.S. involvement. And then these really important points in the long article, Fractured Lands. One pattern does emerge, and it is striking. While most of the 22 nations that make up the Arab world would have been buffeted to some degree by the Arab Spring, the 6 most profoundly affected, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Tunisia, and Yemen, are all republics, not monarchies. And of these 6, the 3 that have disintegrated so completely as to raise doubt that they will ever again exist as functioning states, Iraq, Syria, and Libya, are all members of that small list of Arab countries created artificially and ineptly by Western imperial powers in the early 20th century. In each, little thought was given to national coherence and even less to tribal or sectarian divisions. In these areas that they created, these artificial states of Libya and Iraq and Lebanon, they're not real. They didn't cohere on the ground. They were made by Europeans in Europe after World War I. In fact, all but one of the 6 people profiled in the article you all read are from these artificial make-believe states, and their individual stories are rooted in the larger story of how those nations came to be. The process began at the end of World War I when 2 of the victorious allies, Britain and France, carved up the lands of the defeated Ottoman Empire between them as spoils of war. They win, so they get all the goodies. In Mesopotamia, the British joined together the 3 largely autonomous Ottoman provinces, and they called it Iraq. The southernmost province was dominated by Shiite Arabs, the central province by Sunni Arabs, and the northernmost by non-Arab Kurds. They're not even Arabs. So Iraq makes no sense. To the west of Iraq, the European powers took the opposite approach, carving the vast lands of Greater Syria into smaller, more manageable parcels. Falling under French rule was the smaller rump state of Syria, essentially the nation that exists today, and the coastal enclave of Lebanon, while the British took Palestine and Transjordan, a swath of southern Syria that would eventually become Israel and Jordan. Coming a bit later to the game, in 1934, almost comically, Italy joined the 3 ancient North African regions that it had wrested away from the Ottomans in 1912 to form the colony, the Italian colony of Libya, which is comical on its face. All right, so that is the setup to what we will cover on Thursday, the backlash to the Arab Spring, the response, the equal and opposite reaction to the Arab Spring, which is the Arab winter. See
you have
then.
stopped
Stay
screen
tuned.
share.